Ladies and gentlemen, a good morning and a hugely warm welcome to the Legatum Institute on a very, very wet Monday morning. I think huge congratulations go to everyone for making it, either if you came from the tube to here or by cab to here. We're absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you, and I hope this kicks off your week really well. So just welcoming you to the Legatum Institute. We exist, for those of you who are not familiar with our work, to create pathways from poverty to prosperity for individuals, communities, and nations. And we do that by building open economies, empowered people, and inclusive societies. So you may well ask us, why on earth are we doing an event this morning on character? Well, the reason for it is because when we started looking at the nature of institutions and what made for strong, effective, and good institutions, it becomes very obvious that institutions are only as healthy and as strong and as full as virtue as the people who are leading them and inhabiting them, as I'm sure you experience every single day of the week. And I can remember sitting in the House of Lords one day and listening to an oral question being asked. And the question was, could you tell us, to the minister, could you tell us about gambling and match fixing in the sports industry? And I just started jotting down on a piece of paper, match fixing in the sports industry, and the hacking scandal in the media industry, and the LIBOR scandal in the banking industry, and the expenses scandal in the world of politics. And then today we see on all of our newspapers what's happening to our beautiful young people with Instagram and the social media. And you start thinking every single aspect of our society is only as strong and as healthy as the people actually creating those industries. So we decided to actually have one place in the world of Westminster, in the political world, and in the world of policy making, where character was absolutely central and where we could return some of these conversations to the public square. So last year we kicked off our series with the New York Times journalist David Brooks, who came and did his Road to Character talk, and then we ran pretty much a monthly talk on character. And this year we have the huge privilege of kicking off our series with Arthur Brooks, our great friend, who's the AEI president. And Arthur and I have got to know each other over the last few years. And there are many things I love about this man, but one of the things that I love about this man is his heart and his passion for people, regardless of who they are, regardless of where they've come from the poorest right the way through, and his deep commitment to character in leadership. So Arthur, I'm going to hand over to you now, and welcome to the Legatum Institute. Welcome to London as well this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you, Philippa, and thank you to all of you for coming out on this beautiful morning. I just arrived a few hours ago. I came in on the flight last night. I didn't land this morning, but last night, and it's nice to see that it's light here. It's the first time since I've been here in London on this trip. I'm accompanied here by the former chairman of AEI's board, Tully Friedman, who came in from San Francisco. We're traveling around doing talks we're going from here to Spain, talking about a new book that I have coming out in March called Love Your Enemies. Crazy concept. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I'm going to talk more specifically, as Philippa asked me in this breakfast, about character and leadership. It seems sort of quaint, the idea that there is something that's absolute right and wrong, that we should be able to chart back to our moral principles as leaders. I'm getting a little bit of feedback here on the mic, if we can maybe turn it, it's a little bit hot. And I want to bring you back to something that Philippa just talked about, which was the first principles of the Legatum Institute, which are related to those of my own institution. So I'm the president of the American Enterprise Institute, which has been around since 1938. It's one of the oldest think tanks in the world. And the idea of think tanks as we currently understand them are a little bit newer here in the UK. and they are in the United States, but these are institutions, academic institutions, basically universities without students that are spreading around the world right now. The epicenters of them are in the United States and the UK. My own is based on two moral principles, that there is a radical equality of human dignity, and there's a limitlessness to human potential. And if you believe these are good things, as a leader in particular, you're a guardian of these two moral principles. Again, that tends to sound sort of quaint in an era in which we take it for granted that everybody's in it for him or herself. And I want to talk a little bit about what I see are the challenges today to that, and how all of us can actually put our countries on a better track. I look around this room, all of you are or will be in significant leadership roles. What can we all be thinking about together? What sort of sacred pact can we make and decide on that will make our countries better, our societies better, and indeed make ourselves better and happier people as leaders? We'll have a little time for question and answers, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's on your minds. I want to especially welcome, by the way, the American Enterprise Institute Enterprise Club London chapter. Those of us who are in our group here in London, can you tell me who's here from that? A few of you are actually from our Enterprise Club, and just friends that I've known for a long time. I also want to note that I am leaving as president of AEI, and I'm getting more and more involved with the Legatum Institute. So if you're interested in the work, that you hear about today, we're going to be doing more of it here, and we welcome all of your input. Thanks very much. What I want to talk about is there's an old expression that nice guys finish last. This is something that we've always said in the United States. I know it exists here as well. And I want to talk to you about the evidence that that is quite wrong. And that in point of fact, you can do what your heart tells you to do as your leader and prosper, which is important because that's a kind of a mutual prosperity where people who are good to others actually do better in the long run. All right, let's start here. This is a symphony orchestra. Why do I put this up? Because this is my old line of work. I've been president of AEI for 10 years. 10 years before that, I was a college professor, most of it at Syracuse University. And then for a long time before that, 12 years full-time, I made my living as a classical musician. This is not the typical path to running a think tank. I don't think Philippa did that. But you know, the truth of the matter is, in a free enterprise-based economy, all of you have odd stories, and that's a good thing. You know, we want to be an opportunity society where people can pursue their passions and do different things over the course of their life. I didn't make my living in this particular orchestra. I could have come up with my own orchestra, which was the Barcelona City Orchestra, where I played for a long time. This was something that had been my dream since I was a kid. 9 or 10 years old, my dream was to be a professional French horn player, to play the great classics. Which I loved and in fact still do love. And when I finally made it to a first-tier orchestra, the Barcelona Symphony is the best orchestra in Southern Europe and in the Mediterranean region, I was miserable. I thought it was going to be terrific. I'm playing the music that I love. I'm at the top. I'm top tier of my own skill. What could have been better? It was awful. Why? It was awful because of that guy, the conductor. There's an old axiom in the symphony orchestra business that some conductors are evil geniuses, but all conductors are evil. They're completely controlling. There is a culture among conductors to treat grown men and women who play in the orchestra as children. There's a total lack of autonomy among the workforce. Nobody's ever happy. There's an interesting bunch of data that come from a psychologist at Harvard named Richard Hackman, who looks at creative industries, and he finds, interestingly, that the happiest people in their jobs in the creative industries are chamber musicians, string quartets, for example. The unhappiest are symphony orchestra musicians. You'd think it's pretty close. It's sort of the same thing, like little quartet blown up into a big orchestra, totally different. Quartets decide where they're going to play and when they're going to play it. Orchestra musicians are cogs in a machine run by the evil genius. So I had an interesting sort of epiphany while I was, toiling away in relative misery. The orchestra in Barcelona, the conductor retired. Now he was a a pretty famous guy, a Dutch conductor who had come to Barcelona from Montreal, a Dutch conductor named Franz Paul Dekker. And he was retiring, getting a little bit older, and we were in the market for a new principal conductor. And we were rolling them through one after the other. They were starting to get settled on this one guy. His name was Garcia Navarro. He's long since passed away, a Spanish conductor. And he was much worse than the outgoing conductor. I saw him literally reduce a 65-year-old flute player to tears in front of the entire orchestra. He was dictatorial. He was cruel. He was he made sure that everybody was under his thumb. And I said to the guy next to me, a Spanish guy next to me in the orchestra, I said, man, it's going to be a complete disaster if they pick this guy. And he says, oh, he's horrible, horrible. I sure hope they do pick him. I said, why? He said, because, you know, a Spanish orchestra needs a tyrant. I thought, huh. Funny thing, isn't it? And I realized that I was the only one in my whole section who didn't want a tyrant. Everybody else thought that a Spanish orchestra needs an evil genius. And it turns out that when the world, or when a society, or when a company, or when a government actually feels like there's chaos and there's insecurity, that people kind of want a Spanish conductor because they feel like it's a Spanish orchestra. And I am going to make the case that right now in a lot of our societies, certainly in the United States and the UK, a lot of people think that we're kind of a Spanish orchestra and that we need a despot, but that we don't. So, to begin with, why would somebody want to become one of these conductors? Why would somebody want to become a politician who's known as actually having bad character for the sake of pure power? And there's a lot of research that has gone into this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cruise through some of the management and leadership literature that one typically sees at business schools and policy schools to make the case that it's a perfectly plausible business model for oneself and one's career to do this that basically starts with this. There's a study from 2004 in the journal Science by mostly researchers from Princeton, starting with Daniel Kahneman and Alan Kruger. Daniel Kahneman is one of the only non-economists ever to win the Nobel Prize in economics. He's a psychologist. You know him from Kahneman and Tversky and the work that they did together on imperfect information. Daniel Kahneman did this study in 2004 it was actually a study on happiness. And he had this hypothesis that when you ask people retrospectively in a big survey, what makes you happy about your life? That people lie. For example, people always say, my main source of happiness is my children. But he didn't believe it, right? So he had this, Daniel Kahneman and his co-authors came up with this technique, they called it the day reconstruction technique. And so he would basically get people, they weren't iPhones, they were personal organizers back in the day. And he gave them to a huge group of people, about 300 people. And every 15 minutes or so, it would make a little noise, and they would take it out, and they would have to say, what are you doing, and how happy are you? Right? So in other words, you can't just lie retrospectively about what you think society wants you to say. You have to say, how miserable or how blissful do I feel right now? Right? It's sort of hedonic in its way. And what he found was pretty interesting. In point of fact, most people don't get very much moment-to-moment pleasure when they're taking care of their children. I mean, no big surprise. And the reason for this has to do with the fact that children bring you a lot of meaning, but not a lot of moment-to-moment bliss. A lot of us are parents, big surprise. But he found some other things that were kind of surprising. He found, for example, that in uses of time, there is one activity that brings more unhappiness than any other to the average person. That is spending time with your boss. Now, I didn't want to see, I know. I mean, this is like, and I see this, I'm thinking, I used to think that I would go into the cafeteria at AEI and sit down and my colleagues were happy to see me. Not so much. So I'm, eating lunch in my office alone a lot these days. It is the case that people feel, it has nothing to do with the boss. And it's everything to do with that people generally don't like to be bossed. This is one of the reasons that there's no greater schadenfreude that accrues to somebody than finding out that somebody in power over them has had a personal scandal. It's just the nature of things. We don't like people to have power over. We accept it. We will vote for people who have power over us, but we sort of resent it. This is what this is actually finding. And there's some psychological literature behind this that backs this up. We don't really like being around people who have power over us. Okay, now mix this now with one of the great axioms of leadership that comes from none other than Niccolo Machiavelli. This is the most famous quote from his book, The Prince. In a nutshell, it is, well, fear and love. People want to be feared, people want to be loved, people wish they were loved, but if it turns out you can't be loved, it's better to be feared, and guess what? You can't be loved. That's basically, he's going through these choices that we have. From this arises the question whether it's to be loved rather than feared or feared rather than loved. It might perhaps be answered that we should wish to be both. He's basically saying to the prince that the biggest mistake that leaders make is trying to be both feared and loved, which is impossible, in which case you should be feared. Now, all conductors, all tyrants know this. They know this intuitively. The idea that you can't be really loved. In fact, I have these data from Kahneman from before that show that you really can't be loved in the same way that you can love a friend. As such, embrace the fear that tyranny is the only real way to be an effective leader. Okay, now back to the literature. What do the data say about these tyrannical, bullying, despotic leaders? Wonderful study. This is from 2000. Some of you have seen this from the Harvard Business Review. This is from the psychologist Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman undertook a study in which he looked at 4,000 CEOs across the United States. And in this group, he found 6 basic types of leaders. He did a pretty thorough factor analysis, looking at what leaders do what and what kind of characteristics that they have and what sort of personalities that they have. And he found of 6 basic types, the one that really stands out that looks like what we're talking about is what he calls coercive leaders. These leaders are bullies, but they're willing to do hard things despite what anybody thinks. In other words, that's what my colleague in Barcelona was looking for. We have to do hard things because we're a fractious, raucous, hard to put together group. And so we need somebody who's going to break some heads if it's necessary. And that's what he's finding. Now, this is not the most typical type of leader, but you find it consistently, and you find it across industries. We increasingly find it in government as well. People who are naturally coercive, bullying leaders. Coercive leadership can actually be pretty popular in the short run. When do people want them? When there's a lot of fear, when there's a lot of crisis, you're going to want people who are going to come in and do hard things, that are going to unpopular things that look like my orchestra. And let's talk a little bit about the conditions that would lead this into our political system here today. In any time that there's a financial crisis. Now, when I say financial crisis, I speak as an economist. I don't mean a recession, an ordinary recession. A financial crisis is one in which there's a big asset overhang that has to be cleared. It happens about twice a century. The 2 big ones, of course, in the 20th century were in the late 1920s, early 30s, and 2008. Those are fundamentally different than the recessions that we ordinarily see. They take a long time to clear. And here's the characteristic of a financial crisis. Ordinarily, there's a 10 to 15-year window during which all the experience of economic growth accrues to the top 20% of the income distribution. Okay? Why is it? There's a lot of structural macroeconomic reasons that lead to it. But I want to tell you that there is no economist who's ever been born who knows how to solve this problem. Nobody knows how to get even growth. So you always say, economic growth is too low. Economic growth is never too low after a financial crisis. It's too uneven after a financial crisis. And when people feel that they're not getting their share, they will turn to political populism. It has always happened throughout history. We have data that show this. There's a wonderful book by the economists Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff called This Time is Different, 800 Years of Financial Crises. I mean, I've read it so you don't have to. And it's a great book. It's a great book. And that book shows that, in point of fact, nobody has ever solved the uneven growth problem. That's the biggest legacy of these financial crises. And the knock-on effect of it is really interesting, too. There was a very good paper from the European Economic Review that came out in 2017 that showed that in the 5 to 10 years after a financial crisis, the result is a 30% increase in the political popularity of populist candidates and parties in democratic countries. It's basically President Donald Trump by the numbers in my country. You can figure out what the analog is in your country, or for that matter, any country that has fair and free elections in the wake of the financial crisis. You just see people feel it's unfair, they're not getting theirs, and so they turn to populist leaders who tend to be coercive, they tend to be bullies, they tend to have these characteristics that we're talking about. They are popular. Okay. In other words, we shouldn't be terribly surprised about the moment that we live in. The question is, what can we do? How can we make it better, no matter what your politics are? Now, a little bit of insight into these leaders themselves. One of the interesting bits of research about coercive leaders is that they actually are fooling themselves. Now, remember that nobody really likes to hang out with leaders, even nice leaders, that much. People like to spend time even less with bullies, even less with bullying leaders. The problem with these coercive bullying leaders is that people have a tendency to not to be themselves around them. And the result is that they have an even more distorted view of how people see them. Very quickly, bullying leaders turn into people who think that other people actually love them when they don't. Let me give you a little bit of sort of accompanying information on this. A wonderful study, British study, from the Journal of Adolescence in 1999 that actually looked at bullies of all, this is characteristic of this literature, where they were looking at bullies in school. And what they did was, I mean, it's an amazing thing. You can get tenure for almost anything, it appears. These professors, what they did was they were filming on playgrounds and in schoolyards. And they had a multi-year study with a big grant from the government. It's unbelievable. But they were filming how bullies would victimize smaller, weaker kids. And they wanted to know how other people behaved. So it turns out that bullies always want an audience. It's part of the characteristic, the personality characteristic of coercive leaders, is they do their activities in the presence of other people. They need audiences. And what they find is that on average, bullies, about half of them either join the bully or defend the victim, and the other half stand by passively. Passivity is interpreted as support, but it's not. Nobody likes them. Their support is incredibly brittle. Bullies are about to fall apart at the smallest, slightest provocation. And that's the interesting thing about how weak a leadership model, the coercive leadership model, actually is in politics and in business. How does it usually turn out? People use bullies. It's funny. We think of coercive leaders as those who use their own situation. They're usually used they're usually used by their own followers. They're useful for a period of time. We don't like them. In the end, we tend to turn on them and they end badly. Okay, so when you think about this in politics, we have seen this again and again and again. We're relatively unpopular leaders. They did something really hard, and they ended very poorly. If you want the extreme examples of this, go to non-democratic countries where they wind up swinging from bridges, where it turns out that the population didn't like them from the beginning. So, and we see this in companies as well. Somebody has to come in for the very brutal turnaround and all the layoffs, and they wind up with the rest of the company turning on them. Bullies are the ones who wind up getting the boot, typically in the end, unless they have enough power they can hang on for a long time. So here's the question. What's a better model that can actually work in a period of crisis? In other words, this is not the right one. What's a better one? And how can we cultivate it? Okay, let's go back to Goleman. Daniel Goleman and his Leadership That Gets Results piece from the Harvard Business Review. There were 6 different models. By the way, the coercive leadership model is not necessarily the worst one of the 6. I'm not going to go through all of them. If you were taking my class in public leadership at Harvard, I would take you through all of them, and you didn't come here for that. But there are some that are even weaker, it turns out. One is that everybody thinks is a great leadership model that isn't. It's called pace-setting leadership. The leader who works harder than everybody else. This is classic. where, it's like I got to pitch in. I can't let anybody see me resting if I'm asking other people to work hard. It turns out it's incredibly disheartening for people who work in an organization. Another that's very ineffective is democratic leadership, where everybody gets a say. This is a classic leadership model in nonprofit organizations, where you have to go around the room and make sure that everybody's had a voice. Drives everybody crazy and drives out the top performers chronically. So coercive leadership isn't the only bad way to go, but there are others that are excellent, and the best one is what Daniel Goleman calls authoritative leadership. And let me give you a little bit of a contrast. The modus operandi for the coercive leadership is demands of immediate compliance. Authoritative leadership mobilize people toward a vision. In other words, the coercive leadership says, just do it my way. The authoritative leader says, here is my way, I want you to follow it and make it compelling enough such that people will do that. Do what I tell you versus come with me. The emotional intelligence competencies among the coercive leaders is the drive to achieve versus the self-confidence. What Daniel Goleman calls empathy, although I think empathy is the wrong word here for a second, and I'll tell you why more in a minute. When the style works best is in a crisis for the coercive leaders. For the authoritative leaders, it's when we require a new vision, which can also be in a crisis. And in the end, the overall impact on an organization is negative for the coercive leaders and the most strongly positive for authoritative leaders. How can we be authoritative leaders, and how can we cultivate it among our young people in a new generation of leaders? How can we at the Legatum Institute be talking about this in a positive way and a compelling way? Let's start with a case study. Nelson Mandela. Clearly, South Africa in apartheid days was characterized by coercive leadership. Coercive leadership, particularly on matters of class and race. As all of you know, Nelson Mandela, as a dissident, as a peaceful dissident, but a dissident nonetheless, was in prison for a long time for his political activities in the notorious political prison Robben Island. He spent years, decades in Robben Island. Now, interestingly, his approach when he was in Robben Island, it wasn't clear he was going to get out alive, but his approach was basically acculturating himself with his captors. Some of you may know that when Nelson Mandela was in prison, he learned the Afrikaans language, which was the native language of the prison guards. It was also the native language of those most supportive of the apartheid regime. He also learned how to play rugby, which was the national sport of the Afrikaans-speaking class and the white majority in South Africa. When he got out of prison, he used these skills to bring the country together in a very real way, doing speeches in the language of oppression of South Africa, doing speeches in Afrikaans, and building up the following for the Springboks, which was the national rugby team, and even taking the black majority in South Africa to cheer for the national team, which won the World Cup in rugby, when Nelson Mandela was eventually the president of the country. What an incredible example that he had of bringing people together around a shared vision and usually using culturally iconic elements of the culture in a way that were no longer coercive but authoritative instead. A real inspiration in a meaningful way of an authoritative leader versus the coercive leadership that had come before it, and which turned out to be incredibly brittle. For so long, everybody said that there was nothing that could be done about that regime, and it suddenly fell. That's always the way that it works with coercive leadership. But what about that, it's okay, maybe he's a special case. What about that idea that actually being a good person, authoritative, compelling, somebody that people want to follow, that it actually can't win? You actually lose. Well, it's wrong. And I want to tell you about a couple of studies on this that I like. There's one study, and in this book that I have coming out, I talk about a lot of this stuff in some detail. But one of the studies that I find especially inspirational is one that looks at the case of nice guys in the environment that we are most likely to, we've heard since we were children that they're most likely to fail, which is in the market for love. And we hear that nice guys finish last. If they want to meet a girl, if they want to get married. And so these two researchers at the University of South Carolina put together a pretty compelling study. They published it in a journal. It's a journal for everything. There's a published in a journal called Sex Roles. And it's called the nice guy paradox. Do nice guys really finish last? And what they did was they actually were comparing manipulated photographs of men that had little biographies underneath them. And one was a really neutral guy named Mike, and there's the other guy that was manipulated, was a guy named Todd, who went from ugly to really, really handsome with different biographies. What they found was it didn't really matter how handsome Todd was, he was not preferred the nastier that he got. What he found was that less handsome Mike always beat out Todd when Mike was described as a nicer person. Then, and again, maybe this doesn't match your experience in life, but it certainly is working in the laboratory. To find out that uglier men who are nicer do better in the dating market seems to me to be evidence of the existence of God. Okay. So another interesting study from the Journal of Applied Psychology actually looks at this more in line exactly with what we're talking about here, which looks at civility on advice, leadership, and performance. And this looks at a very large sample of people that are upwardly mobile inside companies, inside the structure of organizations. And they find that the more people are considered to be nice, better listeners, kinder, more humble, the more likely that they are to be seen actually as leaders, to get promotions, and to prosper in their careers. Very, very clear evidence that this is the case over the long period of time. Now, once again, coercive leadership tends to matter when there's a crisis and there's no time. Authoritative leadership matters when there's lots of time and you can develop your own career and when you're trying to cultivate leaders over years or decades, which is why this is a long-term strategy. Okay, what if I don't feel so nice? This is one of the questions. I was actually doing a version of this talk for members of Congress. Because once a month I have an hour with the leaders of congressional committees in Washington, D.C. And it's a sort of a debate training session or communication sessions that we have. It's really fun. It's really interesting too. And one of the questions that they asked when I was talking about the importance of actually being authoritative in the vernacular, being nice, the question was, well, what if I don't feel it? What if I don't feel it? And the answer is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you don't feel it. Let me tell you the story of this guy, French physiologist from the late 19th century named Duchenne. Duchenne had a theory of the human smile. He said he believed it was not culturally based, but physiological, that all people had the same smiling activity on the basis of whether they were happy or not. So he traveled all around the world. He went to New Guinea and Japan and Switzerland and every place in between. Locations all over the world, and he charted the human smile and found that there are 19 types of human smiles, right? Only one is associated with happiness. The other 18 are social, right? There's the flight attendant smile, right? Kind of like that. Right? Now, how do you know when somebody's actually happy when they're smiling? Don't look at the mouth, look at the eyes. There are muscles in the corners of your eyes called the orbicularis oculi muscles. They give you crow's feet. If you want to see if an old person has been happy, look for very pronounced crow's feet. Your goal is to have crow's feet when you're 80, because that means you'll have had a happier life. Now, appropriately, based on the fact that this guy charted out the human smile, they named the true happiness smile after him. This is the Duchenne smile among physiologists still today. And what he found was, again, when you're truly happy, you crinkle up the corners of your eyes. Okay, now, fast forward 100 years. And researchers at the University of Michigan are asking not whether you crinkle up the corners of your eyes when you're happy, but if I make you crinkle up the corners of your eyes, you'll feel happier, right? Reverse causation. Why? Because there was a huge body of literature that was forming at this time that suggested in psychology for the very first time that it's not that action follows attitude, but that attitude follows action. Right? This was following a lot of the work in cognitive behavioral therapy that said if you're depressed, one of the key things for you to do is to pretend that you're not depressed, is to do what non-depressed people do. Get up at a normal time, take off your pajamas, eat breakfast, go out of the house, talk to people. And in so doing, your brain will react. Why? Because there's the stimuli in the left medial prefrontal cortex are highly alive when you're depressed. And what you want is the right prefrontal cortex to start getting more stimuli that comes from day-to-day life. Okay, I tell you all this because they were wondering then, will you feel happier if you fool your brain by doing the smile, that's associated with happiness. And so they had these kids, undergraduates, doing Duchenne smiles manually for 20 seconds at a time, and they basically found that if you force yourself into the smile, you will be happier for 5 minutes. The best thing, by the way, that you can do in the morning on a gloomy Monday morning when it's rainy and dark.
Come to this breakfast.
It's come to this breakfast. Thank you very much. He's not a plant in this audience. Always come to the Legatum Institute to start your week. It is look in the mirror and crunch up your eyes, and you'll actually start to laugh because it's absurd, and you'll be happier as you start your day because of this. This is the reverse Duchenne mechanism of, okay, so what's my point here? Not just that authoritative leaders should be crinkling up the corners of their eyes, but that if you don't feel authoritative, if you don't feel nice, if you don't feel kind toward others, it doesn't matter. You need to fake it, and that will become a new modus operandi. Second question. What's the role of humility? It seems that humble leaders don't do very well. You see a lot of very, very successful leaders in modern life who are the opposite of humble. And so let's look at what the data say on this. And in a nutshell, what they say is that egotistical leaders can succeed, but only in spite of their egotism, not because of it. This is important. I mean, a lot of very successful leaders tend to be very egotistical, but it's not a characteristic that propels their career. The stuff that comes from this is something most of you are pretty familiar with. This is the work of Jim Collins, who's a former management professor and now is kind of a management guru. And his canonical article is on level 5 leadership. This is also from the Harvard Business Review, but it's been published in a lot of different places. And his work looks at a large sample of Fortune 500 firms that over the course, they were matched with ordinary companies that had conventional growth, and they had 3 times the market return for 15 straight years. In other words, these were phenomenally successful companies, and they looked at their leaders. And what they had in common is what he called level 5 leaders. What are level 5 leaders? They have 2 key ingredients. They have incredible will, and they have extreme humility. The credit always goes to other people. Blame always goes to oneself. There's a deflection of personal glory and ambition channeled to the organization. In other words, you can be a pretty successful organization, you can be a pretty successful leader, but the best leaders have these characteristics in common according to these data. Now, I told you a minute ago that I objected to one thing in this authoritative leader description, which says that they tend to be empathetic. I think that actually is not quite true. Why? Because we have a tendency to conflate empathy and compassion. They're not the same thing. There's a great new book out on this one, a guy named Paul Bloom. He's a psychologist at Yale University. And his book, I mean, you have to put a provocative title on your books. Against Empathy, the Case for Rational Compassion. Now, what's he basically talking about here? Empathy is sort of a new thing. We've all been hearing about this only in our adult lifetimes. Empathy is something where we feel somebody else's pain. It's the absolute easiest way out of a difficult situation. You all know, any of you who, like me, have or have had teenage children, know that the worst parents are empathetic. You never feel a teenager's pain because pretty soon you're all in trouble, right? You should be compassionate. Compassion is really hard. It means to do what people need as opposed to feeling what people feel, okay? There's a relation between the two, but great leaders are not actually very empathetic, and what we find across a lot of literature is that great leaders, authoritative leaders, tend to get less empathetic as their career progresses. Less empathy. They feel other people's pain less and less, but they get more compassionate as the years go by. They get better at knowing what people need and what the right thing to do actually is and are willing to do it, notwithstanding the difficulties associated with these actions. Authoritative leaders are compassionate, not empathetic. They're not pleasers. The other thing to keep in mind is that authoritative leaders tend to get angry, but never on their own behalf. There's a whole bunch of work that talks about how people perceive angry leaders. It's quite interesting because you find that when leaders express anger, on their own behalf because of a threat to their own ego, it's actually seen as weakness by others. But when leaders express anger on behalf of those who are weaker than they are, it's perceived as strength. So this is a key thing to keep in mind. Never get angry when somebody threatens you. Always get angry as appropriate, without being out of control, on behalf of people who are less powerful than you are. When you think about it, you think about the leaders that you really admire. Think about your father on his worst day got irritated because you said something that offended him, as opposed to smacking you because you hurt a weaker child. Those were two different cognitive phenomena. They affected you in very, very different ways when you think about the strength of that person who is a strong leader in your life. Same thing is true at leaders at all levels. So empathy, anger, these are all things that lead into the authoritative leadership position. So here's my summary and some action items. Number one, there is a temptation during hard times to be a coercive, bullying, negative leader. Resist that temptation, if for no other reason than for your own survival. The second is adopt the habits of the authoritative, positive level 5 leader. Number one is developing a vision of a better future. The success that's built on other success, kindness, no matter how you feel, iron will plus humility, anger on behalf of those with less power, and compassion being greater than empathy. Now, you can think of examples around this. One of the examples that I like right here is Philippa Stroud, in the way that she's rebuilding the Legatum Institute. These are characteristics I see in all of what she's done to rebuild this institute, to draw all of you in and into a community of people dedicated to ideas of serving the poor and of character and leadership. That's why I want to be part of this, because that's what I see going on here. And with that, I turn it over to you. All right. And if any of you want to come and learn more, I'll be teaching a class on this at Harvard in the spring, in the fall. If any of you are in the market for your MBA. All right. Anybody want to kick it off? Any thoughts that you have? Yes, sir.
So let's go back to Machiavelli. So David Harvey,
Yeah.
Westminster Council. Go back to Machiavelli in Florence. He was working with people who often would have been good authoritative leaders, but dealing with the other states around Florence, dealing with incredibly assertive bullies, they didn't stand a chance. How does a naturally assertive person, leader, deal with incredibly powerful bullies?
It's an interesting question. It depends. So to make sure I understand your question, how does an assertive person or somebody who has enough confidence to do what's required deal with coercive leaders or bullies in his or her midst?
Exactly.
So there is a pretty interesting body of work on how you deal. So basically we're saying, how do you deal with a bad boss? How do you deal with bad coworkers? How do you deal with things like this? And the evidence is really mixed because the circumstances are so really different, as it turns out. To begin with, what I'm talking about is when you're a leader in the interior, not how you're actually dealing with parallel states or other companies or God forbid, when you actually have a conductor. How did I deal with my coercive bullying conductor? I quit my job. And that's actually what people ordinarily do. There's the most famous paper on this is by a guy named Adolf Hirschman. And many of you have read it. It talks about 3 techniques that people have when they're around a coercive bullying leader: exit, voice, and disloyalty. So these are the 3 techniques. You start with voice, which is to say you complain, you say, I don't like it, you say it's not right. The second is disloyalty. You start to subvert it. And then third, if that doesn't work, you leave. Is basically how that works. That's different than in international relations, but just as an idea of how people cope with it. Take it back to, since I'm talking about the virtues of not being a coercive bullying leader, if you are, you will wind up failing because of voice, disloyalty, and exit. That's the reason that you will fail. And as we map those 2 things together. When it comes to being in a bad neighborhood, is what you're talking about. You know, Machiavelli was talking about city-states where they had to cope with other city-states that were really pugilistic and thus really dangerous. And the answer is that you actually have to be a realist along those lines. I mean, what you want are people that are pretty authoritative in international relations, but are really strong and tough. we're trying to cope with this and understanding what this means in foreign policy in the UK and the United States. It is a really, really dangerous world, and we want to actually show, have a moral compass to show actually what it means to be an authoritative leader countries around the world, but at the same time, we can't be stupid. We also have to stand up to tyranny, and so that's a particular balance. That doesn't mean that we're coercive and bullying, particularly in the interior of our countries, but it does mean that we actually have to show sufficient strength. Once again, recall that authoritative leaders show anger and actually can be violent and tough at times, but not on behalf of the ego of the leader per se, which is really important and something and to put a finer point on this, you can imagine how we're trying to cope with that in the United States today. Yes, sir?
Jonathan Taylor coming, Silvermix Academy. Quick question, does this make a difference from the mindset of the people? Sorry. Kids these days have a very different outlook to the way we grew up.
Yeah.
We have teenagers, so we understand that a little bit. Does the mindset of a teenager these days, or the next generation, generations Y and Z, does that make a difference to their acceptance of the leader? You know, the whole do they want a democratic leader, or is there a difference there across the generations?
That's a good question, and I love that question, as a matter of fact. And almost every generation sees the generation that's coming up as not respecting leadership. So you go back to Plato or the Bible. Woe be unto this generation, right? I mean, it's always woe be unto this generation. The way that generations work, there used to be lots of research on this, and there isn't as much. It's sort of out of fashion right now. But generally, every 2 decades is considered to be an identifiable generation. So the last one that's still alive is what we in the States call the greatest generation, born between 1905 and 1925. There's just a few of them left. They were named the greatest generation by the greatest generation. And you know, why do they call themselves that? Because they were in contrast to the generation that followed them, which they called the silent generation, born between 1925 and 1945. Why were they called that? Because the greatest generation won the war in the UK and the United States. They won the war. And the silent generation didn't fight any wars. And they didn't get involved as much. They didn't get involved in their communities as much. They were called the silent generation. They didn't really follow the rules. They really weren't that patriotic. They really didn't care. Sounds familiar, right? The silent generation, they were followed by the dreaded baby boom. You know, a lot of us are, at the very, very end of the baby boom. But the baby boom was considered to be just the worst slackers. Right after the war, in your country and mine, there's a huge called a baby boom because obviously it was a demographic phenomenon. But it was really derisive the way that people talked about that. Followed by Generation X, followed by the millennials, and now followed by iGen or Gen Z, depending on how you want to talk about it. It's very interesting now to me because I've spent the last decade or so of my career regretting the existence of the millennials. A bunch of snowflakes. They can't take any sort of. Being the boss of millennials it's a nightmare. You criticize them, they have to go home for the rest of the day. I mean, it's just. And now the funniest thing is that millennials are in their 30s. They're in their early 30s at this point, and they're starting to become bosses, and they're hiring people that are coming out of college who are in this thing called iGen or Gen Z, and they hate them. Like, they're undisciplined, they don't want to work. It's like, it was ever thus, right? And so you grow up and become boss, or even worse, become dad. And so the truth of the matter is that that's a characteristic. It's what we in social scientists we call an empirical regularity, that young people are terrible. And that they're bad followers. And what it means is that I actually, with a little bit of distance from it, not just thinking of it as a father and as a CEO, I think it's pretty much the same every generation. Yeah. Yes, sir. I love that question, by the way. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I'm James Bethel, and I'm senior counsel at Legatum. I wanted to bring it back to political systems and where you started your presentation, talking about the kind of leaders we've got at the moment, many of which are bullies. How do we? Is it true that you end up with the leaders you deserve? And if so, how do we manage a process of renewal in our political systems and institutions to ensure that we take the steps towards a new generation of inspiring, authoritative, and generally better leaders?
Thank you. So that's why I wrote this book, Love Your Enemies. And I think it comes out in UK on March 5th. It comes out in the States a week later. Okay, and exactly to answer that question. Do we get the leaders that we deserve is a different question. So Ed Koch, who was the mayor of New York City for a long time, some of you may remember his name, and Ed Koch was finally, it happened what always happens if you're in a democracy, if you keep running enough times, you'll lose. And he lost a really bitter and tough fought election, and after the election, a journalist asked him just his thoughts, and he said, the people have made their decision, and now they're going to have to pay. So do people in a democracy get more or less what they deserve? No, not necessarily, but they do get what they ask for. And again, when people are in a panic, they will tend to turn toward coercive leaders. Those are brittle and basically unpopular. And let me give you an example of that from the United States today. There's new work that comes out. This guy, he's an Australian guy, but he lives here. His name is Tim Dixon. Is he here? Tim's not here, right? There's Tim Dixon. Hi, Tim. I didn't see you in the back. This runs the organization called More in Common. You'd have to learn more about More in Common if you want to have greater belief in humanity, because and basically if you want to think that there's an opportunity for things to be okay. He's got a brand new report that came out and what's it called? The report that came out 5 months ago? Hidden Tribes. And I'm gonna give you one statistic from it, and then Tim can fill in the details if he wants, that suggests that 93% of Americans hate how divided we've become as a country. 93%. Now, man, nothing polls at 93%. I've been looking at public opinion research my whole career. Nothing. My mother doesn't poll at 93%. Nothing polls at 93%. But 93% of us hate how divided we become. What does that mean? To me, that means that 7% are profiting from the bullying coercive leadership style. They're basically making money and prestige and power and fame on the basis of driving us apart. We are being terrorized and manipulated as countries by 7%. They're going to get theirs, because I've got the data that show that. In the meantime, we actually have to form a new kind of populist movement, an authoritative populist movement, one that's ethical, one that's kind, one that's respectful, one that actually believes that we should and can come together as a country. Here's, Tim, am I fair? Is this characteristic? You got to read, Hidden Tribes, you have to read the report. It's really, really important. It got tons of play, and it will continue to. It's important work, and I urge you all to support the work that Tim is doing. Okay, what does this mean in my view? This means that we can have better times coming if we encourage better times to come. That we have an opportunity to basically stand up, and as we say in the States, to stand up to the man. The media, the politicians, the entertainment industry, the angry campus activists who are basically the 7% that are profiting from making a kind of a Hobbesian all against all world. It's not what we want, and it's not what we have to get. Politicians and people in media today who basically say that you have to hate your neighbor or have to hate your fellow citizens are basically offering a kind of a switch. A switch is one in which if you do this, everything will be different. That's not how democracies work. Democracies are dials, not switches. And the idea that we can dial one way or the other is the reason that we have elections, and the reason that we have parties, and the reason that we actually form coalitions. But to go from one switch to, that's how Hugo Chavez thinks that life is a switch. People who live in the UK or the United States should realize that life is a dial. And we've been led by politicians and media that want us to think that we're in a switch-based society when we aren't, which is the reason we're not getting what we want, why it's unsatisfying, and why now Tim is finding a 93% and rising level of discontent with the status quo. How does it change? And the answer is you get demand for change at the public level, followed by supply for change, which is leaders that are reacting to the demand. That's typically what we find in social movements and in social change. Leaders are actually not leaders. Leaders are followers. Leaders follow the perception of public sentiment. There's no leader who says, nobody wants this, but I'm going to instantiate a latent demand for something. That's not how politicians work. That's not even how CEOs work. They say, people really want this, but nobody's providing it. They have a kind of conventional entrepreneurship model. And that's what I think we will tend to see, and we can encourage it beforehand, particularly those of us who are in a position of cultivating young people. Okay, last question, and it's right here in the middle. Yes, sir.
Thanks, David Nussbaum, Chief Executive at The Elders. Your summary, sorry?
What's The Elders?
The Elders is a group of former mainly presidents or UN Secretaries General who work on peace and human rights, about a dozen of them. Your summary and action item sort of says people need to adopt the habits of the authoritative, positive, level 5 leader. But aren't some, at least some, coercive, bullying, negative leaders, they may not have the capability to adopt the habits of others. This sort of feels like it's predicated on people have choices about what kind of leaders they're going to be, but maybe some kinds of leaders don't really have those choices. How do we respond to them?
It's a good question. The answer is they need to be deposed. They need to be replaced. That's what I took from Tim's report. You know, look, of the 7%, some can be rehabilitated and some can't. We don't have time to be living with leaders who are in the 7% zone, who are taking our societies in the wrong direction. And what happens is you will replace, it doesn't have to be a bloody coup. But the beautiful thing about democracy is that as a competition of political ideas, we can peacefully replace people who don't represent us in an adequate and appropriate way. And that's what, in my view, we actually need to do. And we will do. It's just going to be more painful or less so. And if we have a new generation of leaders that we are cultivating that have more authoritative leadership characteristics, as opposed to being told and learning that the coercive leadership style is optimal, we'll more likely be able to backfill them with people that we can count on. So the answer is change people that we can and change out the people that we can't. And with that, my friends, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. What a delight it is to be with you. Thanks.
Arthur, can we just say a huge thank you to you? It is really an amazing way to start a whole week with these thoughts in our minds as we go forward. The question was asked, what can we do about it? Do we get the sort of leaders that we deserve? The whole purpose of doing these sorts of events, of putting character back at the heart of the public square debate, is to actually raise issues like this and actually say we can become the sort of leaders that actually prosper a nation, that prosper the institutions that we lead. And we don't have to reconcile ourselves to seeing bullying sorts of leadership. And lots of people say to me about our political landscape at the moment and what's going on in the US at this moment in time, how can we renew our political system? Actually, we renew it by people like you and people like me, standing for office, leading great companies and leading great institutions. So we're delighted, Arthur, that you were here with us today. When Arthur dropped me an email saying, I'm going to be in London, do you want me to do anything? I said, yes, all day. So thank you so much. And we're so looking forward to working with you again. And have a great week, guys. See you soon.